Okay, so I am just going to talk for a minute while I'm driving on this safe country road about COVID denialism, conspiracy theories, and the right way to respond to an event like this. So, right now, a lot of people are sharing this YouTube documentary by a prominent anti-vax person who claims to not be anti-vax like they all do until you see that they all speak at the anti-vax conferences and they've all got RFK Jr., the principal promoter of anti-vax stuff, promoting their stuff. And so, let's just be honest who these people are. They're anti-vax people. They don't believe in public health in a standard way. They kind of think of public health as a tool of domination. And of course, things like the past of the Tuskegee experiments and so on make that plausible in people's minds. It makes sense to them that public health could be a tool of domination. That's why you see a lot of outside of the West, in Africa, in South Asia, Central Asia, skepticism from different communities about vaccinations. And that's because of the relationship between international aid, humanitarian aid, and colonialism. And it's an unfortunate side effect of utilizing the tools of science and reason and medicine for colonial purposes. That's the consequence of what you get. The consequence of that is that it's going to undermine the case, the objectivity, the neutrality of such measures. And, all that aside, let's just get on with this. I'm not gonna go into Plandemic in excruciating detail. I'm just gonna say that this person, there's a good article in Snopes about how this person is lying, about how they're an anti-vaxxer, about how they falsified research, and that more than one body of scientists have called them out for this practice. So it's a bunch of nonsense. But all of this stuff comes down to responses to the pandemic and what's appropriate. One form is denial, and it can be anything from just saying it's a case of the flu, it's a particularly nasty flu, or the numbers are inflated. It's not really, basically accusing hospitals around the country of committing an extremely illegal form of fraud by inflating their COVID death numbers in order to get money. This is the most standard conspiracy theory. And the sad thing about that one is that there's going to be, with all the hospitals and all of the corruption of privately owned hospitals, I'm sure there's going to be a case or two out there of this actually happening. And that's going to blow up this idea that hospitals are calling anyone who dies a COVID death and inflating the numbers, and that's for them to get money, and it's because they want to hurt the president and so on. All right. So, denial of the extent of the coronavirus epidemic, or this sort of denial that the country is stuck in right now in the United States is based on President Trump and the Republican Party. What they're doing is just kind of being like, well, okay, it's not the Black Death, so I guess we're going back to work. And they're not really denying in a lot of their material that what the decisions they're making are going to cause deaths, a lot of deaths. It's just sort of putting your head in the sand. It's the same kind of logic. I had a family member who said, oh, hey, look, your gym will be open don't you want to go back? After we had just been discussing how dangerous the pandemic was, and I said, just because it's open doesn't mean I have a death wish for myself or for you, an elderly, immunocompromised person. So, there's that layer of denial. There's another layer that I think is, and I'm using here Alain Badiou, philosopher's, his schema for ways that people respond to events. There's denial, or faithfulness, or obfuscation, occlusion. So we'll get to that third one in a minute. The second one is faithfulness. I think faithfulness in this situation is to say, we're going to listen to scientific authorities. We're only going to, we're not going to criticize science itself. We're going to criticize particular instances of scientific failing with better science. That's the most basic thing that these folks, they go in wanting for there to be magical thinking about how the world functions because it's easier for them. So anytime they can undermine scientific methodology itself, they go for it. And you know what is inevitable with scientific methodology? Incomplete, inconclusive, and incorrect results. That's how we get to knowledge, is by working our way through various scenarios, through interpreting data in different ways and testing our hypotheses, seeing them fail, modifying them, seeing them fail, and moving on and on and on. And that's how science works. So faithfulness in this case involves respect for public health officials and the scientific community and the scientific consensus on pandemics, on epidemiology in general. And then it involves support for our healthcare workers, calling for them to have necessary PPE, personal protection equipment, calling for them to have proper funding, getting hazard pay, serious hazard pay, measures to protect their families, making measures to protect us in general as well through coordination of this medical disaster, making sure there's enough ventilators, there's enough hospital beds, that people don't have to pay for this care, all that kind of stuff. And of course, then there's another layer of, if we can't work without dying, perhaps we should have a rent moratorium and a mortgage moratorium, and we should have universal basic income and stimulus payments and unemployment benefits and measures to try to prevent companies from laying off workers, and so on and so on and so on. Expansion of Medicaid. The list goes on. That's the faithful response. The one that only looks at the scientific consensus on how these things work instead of various forms of magical thinking. The final response is the most dangerous and the one that veers close to fascism or is outright fascism. That's occlusion, obfuscation. It's, in this case, I think, clearly expressed through conspiracy theories. And fascism has long been a source of conspiracy theory. In place of a real analysis of how power works to create knowledge, to limit our access to knowledge, to frame knowledge. Absent that, we go for a story of them, liberals, the World Health Organization, China. Usually it ends up being, you guessed it, the Jews. Jewish folks get, implicated in this every single time. And, whether it's the 5G conspiracy theory or it's Bill Gates is trying to get us all injected with his little nanobots for monitoring and control, it's all based on these paranoid fantasies of power that are often, paradoxically, glomming on to actual conditions of real domination. You know, these people who are like, oh, yes, Trump and the capitalist class, they want martial law. Why would they want or need martial law? He's already the president. They already rule. Capitalists already rule our society. We already work for them. We don't need some goose-stepping folks in black shirts, you know, walking down the street to get us ruled by this system. It's already there. I know I'm getting a little off topic here, but essentially what these COVID denial, conspiracy theory, occlusion types present us with is the real frightening danger of the darkest side of pandemics. During the Black Death, a lot of Jewish communities were hunted down and exterminated because they were blamed for the Black Death. This is the kind of thing that we're facing right now. These white men with guns and Kevlar vests are essentially storming state capitals in a form of terrorism, and then the president tweets out his support for their actions and calls them good people. It just so happens that they're in collusion with big business that wants people to return to work for them. And the people who are saying, I want a haircut, I want my nails done, they're saying they want their servants back. It's so dark and frightening and outrageous. And in the middle of all of this, undermining our trust in public health, undermining our trust in science, spreading anti-vaccination ideology. This is deadly serious, dangerous stuff, and it has to be stopped. You should be outraged. You should be incredibly angry at anyone who expresses these sentiments. They need to be called out immediately. Now, I understand. Like I was saying earlier, we're all primed for believing this kind of nonsense. You know, I went through it myself as a young leftist, you know, messing around with 9/11 truther stuff, especially after the Iraq war, and the government lied to get us into a war. But you know what it took for me to get through it was to, one, consider the sources, two, really look into what the claims are. You know, are they backed up by science? Are they following Occam's razor? Is it like an incredibly outlandish game of chess that they are suggesting that government officials are undertaking? In that case, it's probably false. Almost always false. Look, a lot of planning goes on in our societies by big companies, by governments and so on. But they are nowhere near as competent and coordinated as these conspiracy theories give them credit for. Exhibit A, B, C, D throughout the freaking alphabet. Add some extra alphabets. You just watch the news regularly. Become a regular consumer of multiple sources of media. I don't know, for English language, check out Al Jazeera English, The Guardian, and the BBC. Get you some sources like the Times of India, and on and on and on. Sample a lot of things so that you get a flavor for, things outside of U.S. corporate media propaganda stuff. And what you learn real quick is that these people have no plans beyond next week. And they are massively incompetent, especially the current administration, but even those who came before them, and they don't know what they're freaking doing in any of these situations. They're making up as they go. They're trying to maintain a semblance of public order and a semblance of the dignity of higher office for government. In some ways that's not a bad thing. In other ways, it's just another form of lying to us and being in denial about just how bad things are. I mean, we are in a global system right now that is cooking the planet. It is cooking the planet. Everyone is essentially staying home around the world, and we've barely made a dent in carbon emissions, and yet they tell us endlessly that it's our fault, that we're the ones who are responsible, that humans are the virus, and so on. No, it's this system. It's capitalism. Oh my God, it's so straightforward and simple. It is incredibly profitable for the people, for the companies who have enormous amounts of wealth and power and control over various governments around the world and a stranglehold on the world economy. It's profitable for them to put their heads in the sand and pretend like this isn't happening, like we're not literally cooking the planet and ourselves on it. And when denial no longer works, then they move to obfuscation. That's when we go from denying climate change to blaming something or someone else to creating scapegoats. That's what's happening already with this pandemic. Denial isn't working. Too many body bags. Too much frightened populace for just pretending it's not happening. I mean, I've got a family member who's a diehard Trump supporter, but nonetheless is terrified of the pandemic because their germophobia is stronger than their allegiance to Trump. They're not really anti-Trump in any way, don't get me wrong, since all this has begun, but they just don't listen. They're still afraid, okay? So people are afraid, so we got to move on to something else. So we're going to blame someone else. It's China's fault. It's the World Health Organization. It's fucking Anthony Fauci. They're blaming Fauci, like this one public figure that we can look to with some modicum of respect and trust in this terrifying time, and trying to make him the responsible party for the pandemic. This is so crazy. What's so crazy to me, too, with these conspiracy theories, you know, the most mainstream of them blame China. I remember reading the news in November and December and January and February. I remember as these things happened, and they're telling me, you know, it's this ultimate gaslighting. They're telling me that it didn't happen, that I didn't read it that way. I wrote stuff about this in my journal in January about how afraid I was of this potentially turning into a pandemic based on what was happening in China and Hubei province. My God. Anyway, I'm done angry ranting here, but just to review, using Alan Badou's model of response to an event, we can be in denial, we can obfuscate, try to confuse the matter, create scapegoats, or we can be faithful to what it calls us to be, to the responsibility that is necessitated by the event, by the truth of that event. In this case, stay home, wash your hands, support nurses and doctors, listen to epidemiologists, don't listen to Trump, don't listen to Plandemic lady, don't listen to anti-vaxxers, don't listen to 5G idiots, don't listen to people blaming China and the World Health Organization. Be real. Grow up. Thing wasn't designed in a lab. It evolved. Learn some science. Disgusted today. Anyway, I'm out. Probably not even going to publish this. It's awful.